She had been standing at the window every morning for 11 months, not looking at anything in particular, just standing. I could see her from the rose bed along the east wall, which is where I spent the first 2 hours of most mornings between April and October, working the soil and checking the canes, and doing the particular quiet work that roses require if you want them to be honest about what they are. I could see her in the window above the garden, and she could not see me, or if she could, she did not register me, which is the same thing for our purposes. She was a tall woman, late 40s, with the kind of stillness that is not peace. I knew the difference between those two kinds of stillness. I had lived inside both of them. The stillness of peace is a body that has found where to put itself. The stillness of grief is a body that has stopped knowing where to go and is simply waiting for the information to arrive. She was waiting, every morning, at the window above the east garden, for 11 months before the morning when everything changed. If you have ever lost something that reorganized every room in your life and learned to keep living in the rooms anyway, this channel is for you. Subscribe right now, because every story here is for the people who have been to the bottom of a loss and found, eventually, that the bottom has a floor. It takes longer than anyone tells you, but it has a floor. I know because I found mine in a garden in the 2nd year after my wife died, and what I found there I want to tell you about before I tell you anything else. My name is Samuel Osei. I am 56 years old. I am the head groundskeeper for an estate called Whitmore in Winnetka, Illinois, 12 acres of grounds that I have been maintaining for 9 years, which is long enough to know every inch of the property and to understand what the property requires in each season, and to have developed, over 9 years of that understanding, a relationship with this land that is the closest thing I have to a home outside my own apartment. I want to tell you something about what it means to tend a place for 9 years, because I think most people think of groundskeeping as maintenance, and it is not maintenance. Maintenance is the preservation of a static state. Groundskeeping is the continuous negotiation between what a place is and what it is becoming, which is a negotiation that never ends and that you never win, and that you would not want to win, because the winning would mean the place had stopped becoming, which would mean it had stopped being alive. A garden is always in the process of dying and being born simultaneously. A gardener's job is not to stop either of those processes, but to tend the relationship between them. I have been tending that relationship for 30 years across many different properties, and I have found that it is not very different in its essential nature from the relationship between grief and living, which is also always simultaneously dying and being born, which also cannot be forced in either direction, which also requires, more than any other single thing, the willingness to keep showing up. I am 56 years old. I am the head groundskeeper for an estate called Whitmore in Winnetka, Illinois, 12 acres of grounds that I have been maintaining for 9 years, which is long enough to know every inch of the property and to understand what the property requires in each season, and to have developed, over 9 years of that understanding, a relationship with this land that is the closest thing I have to a home outside my own apartment. I am a single father. My daughter Abina is 28 years old. She is a botanist at the Chicago Botanic Garden, which is either a coincidence or the direct result of growing up in the years after her mother died, watching her father disappear into the garden every morning, and coming to understand that the garden was not where he was hiding, but where he was surviving, and which I choose to believe is the latter, because it makes the loss of those years mean something beyond the loss itself. Abina is the reason I kept going in the first year after Grace. Not because she needed me in any dramatic way. She was 19 and capable, and had her mother's refusal to be stopped by anything. But because the need to be present for her gave me a reason to get up every morning that existed independently of how I felt about getting up, which in the first year was very little reason indeed, and the externally imposed reason turned out to be enough to carry me to the internally generated one, which arrived eventually in the 2nd year, like the first shoot in the cutting garden. Small, definite, entirely worth waiting for. She is a botanist at the Chicago Botanic Garden, which is either a coincidence or the direct result of growing up in the years after her mother died, watching her father disappear into the garden every morning, and coming to understand that the garden was not where he was hiding, but where he was surviving, and which I choose to believe is the latter because it makes the loss of those years mean something beyond the loss itself. My wife's name was Grace. She died 9 years ago of a cardiac event, which is what they call it when a perfectly healthy 44-year-old woman simply stops while she is making coffee on a Saturday morning in October and does not start again. We had been married for 19 years. Abina was 19, I was 47, and the man I had been for 19 years stopped existing in the space of a Saturday morning, and what was left was someone I did not recognize and did not know how to be. Grace was a teacher. She taught 3rd grade at a school in Evanston for 16 years, and she was, by every account of every parent and child who passed through her classroom, the kind of teacher you remember for the rest of your life, the kind who teaches you something true about yourself rather than just the curriculum. She had a way of making children feel that what they thought mattered, which is the rarest gift a teacher can have, and the one that does the most lasting good. She also had, and I say this with the full and particular love of a man who has had 25 years to understand it, an absolute refusal to do anything slowly that could be done quickly, which is what made the Saturday morning coffee so unexpected, because Grace was not someone you could imagine stopping. She was always the first person moving in any room she was in. The stillness of that October morning was the first stillness I had ever seen in her, and I did not know what to do with it, and I am not sure, 9 years later, that I fully do. She died 9 years ago of a cardiac event, which is what they call it when a perfectly healthy 44-year-old woman simply stops while she is making coffee on a Saturday morning in October and does not start again. We had been married for 19 years. Abina was 19. I was 47, and the man I had been for 19 years stopped existing in the space of a Saturday morning, and what was left was someone I did not recognize and did not know how to be. I want to tell you what I did with that, not because the details are important in themselves, but because the details are the whole story. They are the reason I knew what to do when the woman at the window finally came down into the garden. I did what I had always done when I did not know what to do, which is I went outside. I have been going outside when I do not know what to do since I was a child in Accra, since my grandfather took me into his garden when I was 7 years old and showed me how to put a seed in the ground, and told me that the earth does not care about your troubles, but it will take them from you if you give it your hands. I had been giving the earth my hands for 49 years by the time Grace died. When she died, I gave it more hours than I had ever given it before. Not because the garden fixed anything, because it gave me something to tend when everything else I had tended was gone. I want to tell you what the 2 years after Grace looked like in practice, because I think the practice is what matters, and most accounts of grief skip past the practice to the conclusion, which gives people who are in the middle of it the impression that there is a conclusion to reach in any reasonable time frame, which there is not. The 2 years after Grace looked like this. I got up every morning. I made coffee, which was the first thing I had to learn to do differently because Grace had always made the coffee, and the coffee maker was the first thing that ambushed me every day for 6 months. I drove to whatever property I was working and I put my hands in the soil. I picked Abina up from school on the days she was with me. I cooked dinner, which Grace had also usually done and which I was not good at, and which I became adequate at over the course of a year out of necessity. I called my sister on Sundays. I kept the apartment clean because Grace had been particular about a clean apartment, and keeping it clean was the only way I could think of to keep her particular about something. None of this looked like healing from the outside. It looked like a man going through motions. From the inside, it felt the same. But the motions were what I had, and so the motions were what I did. And what I did not know until year 2 was that the motions were doing something that I could not yet see. The way a seed underground does something you cannot see, until the morning it does not. Grief has a quality that most people who have not been through it do not understand, and that quality is its relationship with time. Grief does not move forward. It does not progress from worse to better in a straight line that you can chart and anticipate and plan around. Grief moves the way a garden moves, which is to say in cycles, not progress, and the cycles do not shorten on any schedule you get to set. There are days in the second year that are harder than any day in the first year. There are moments in the third year that arrive without warning and contain the full weight of the first week. What the garden taught me, in the years after grace, was not to fight the cycle but to be inside it, to be in the season that was actually happening rather than trying to move past it to the next one. You cannot force a garden into summer. You can only prepare the ground and put in the seed and wait. The waiting is not passive. The waiting is the work. I did not understand this when Grace died. I learned it over 2 years of getting my hands in the soil every morning and noticing, gradually and then all at once, that the learning was happening and that I was different at the end of the second year than I had been at the beginning of the first, and that the difference was not that the loss had diminished but that I had grown around it, the way a tree grows around a wound, incorporating the damage into its structure without being destroyed by it. That was what 9 years of mornings in the garden had given me. That was what I brought to Whitmore Estate when I came to work here. And that was what the woman at the window needed, though neither of us knew it yet. I want to tell you about the money before I tell you about Eleanor, because the money is part of the story, and I want to give it its proper place, which is not the center, but not nowhere either. In the 11 months before the morning she came down into the garden, Eleanor Hartwell had spent, by my understanding from what circulates in a house like Whitmore when you are paying attention, a significant portion of what most people would consider a fortune on grief. She had retained grief counselors of several different schools and approaches. She had attended a retreat in the Swiss Alps that was designed for people of considerable means who had experienced significant loss. She had commissioned a memorial garden for James at a botanical institution in his name, which was a generous and genuine gesture that I do not say anything against. She had funded a wing of the hospital where James had died. She had done all of the things that a person with resources does when they are trying to solve a problem with resources, which is the only tool she had been taught to use and which was the wrong tool for this particular problem, not because money is bad but because grief is not a problem. Grief is a process, and processes cannot be funded into resolution. They can only be moved through, season by season, at whatever pace the season sets. The woman's name is Eleanor Hartwell. She is 49 years old. She is the sole heir to the Hartwell family fortune, which was built over 3 generations in pharmaceutical manufacturing, and which is, by the metrics that matter to people who track these things, substantial. She is also the widow of a man named James Hartwell, who died 17 months before the morning I am about to describe, of a cancer that was diagnosed in April and finished its work in November, 7 months from finding to gone. I learned about Eleanor and James the way I learn most things about the people whose property I tend, in fragments and at the edges of other conversations, and through the particular evidence that a house and its grounds always offer to anyone paying attention. I learned that they had been married for 22 years. I learned that they had been planning to retire to the south of France, a plan that had been on the table for 5 years, and which had not yet been executed, because there was always one more thing to do before the life they had been building could be lived. I learned that Eleanor had spent the 7 months of James's illness doing what people with resources do when someone they love is dying, which is spend the resources on every possible intervention and outcome and alternative in the hope that resources are the variable that determines the result. They are not. James died in November. The south of France remained unvisited. The garden below Eleanor's window was left, in the months of his illness and the months of her grief that followed, largely to me. I want to tell you about what 9 years of tending a property teaches you about the people who live on it, because I think most people underestimate what a groundskeeper sees and knows. 9 years is long enough to read a property the way you read a person, through what changes and what stays the same, and what the changes mean. I knew, from the state of the cutting garden in the months of James's illness, that he had been the one who cared about it most, because the beds that Eleanor tended stayed immaculate, and the beds that James had planted went slightly wild in the way that a garden goes when the person who loved it is not able to tend it. I knew, from the way the lights in the house changed in the weeks after November, which rooms Eleanor moved through and which ones she avoided. I knew, from the untouched state of the kitchen garden in the spring after James died, that she was not cooking, which is a thing you notice when you supply vegetables to a kitchen, and the kitchen stops asking for them. I knew all of this the way a groundskeeper knows a property, which is to say completely and without any particular plan to use the knowledge. The knowledge was simply there, accumulated over 9 years of paying attention to the place that was in my care. And it was there, in the April morning when Eleanor finally came outside, when I needed it. I want to tell you about Whitmore's garden before I tell you about the morning everything changed, because the garden is the other character in this story, and it deserves a proper introduction. Whitmore is a property that was designed in the late 1920s by someone who understood that a garden is not decoration. It is structure. The formal beds along the east wall are planted in a progression that moves from the earliest spring bulbs through the rose season and into the late summer perennials, so that something is always in the process of beginning or ending or being in full expression of itself, which is the condition of all living things, and which a good garden makes visible in a way that is useful to anyone willing to look at it long enough. There is an old apple tree at the south end of the garden that was here before the house and that has been pruned and shaped by every groundskeeper who came before me, whose lives I can read in the tree the way you read the generations of a family in a face. There is a kitchen garden along the north wall where I grow vegetables that the house uses, which is a practical thing, and also, in the way that practical things are often secretly important, a demonstration that the ground produces what is needed if you give it what it needs. And there is, at the center of the garden, a long rectangular bed that was James Hartwell's particular project, a cutting garden that he had planted and tended himself on weekends with the specific enthusiasm of someone who has found a hobby late in life and is making up for lost time. After November, nobody touched the cutting garden. I kept the beds in it clean. I did not replant it. It was not mine to replant. The morning everything changed was in April, the 11th month after James's death, the 3rd week of spring, the kind of Illinois morning that arrives without apology after a long winter, cold still but with a specific quality of light that means it is not going to be cold much longer. I was at the rose bed along the east wall when I heard the door from the kitchen open and close. I did not look up. I kept working. I have found over 9 years that the best thing a groundskeeper can do when the person who owns the grounds appears unexpectedly is to keep doing the work, because the work creates a kind of permission for the other person to be outside without having to explain why they came out, which is often a thing they do not yet know themselves. I heard her footsteps on the path. Slow. The walk of someone who has not been outside in a long time and is relearning the texture of it. She stopped at the edge of the rose bed. I looked up then because she had been standing there long enough that not looking up would have been its own statement. She was in a coat over what appeared to be morning clothes, a woman who had come outside on an impulse before she had time to reconsider it. She looked at the rose bed. She said, "They're coming back." I said, "They do every year." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "James used to say that about the garden, that it was proof things come back." I did not say anything. I kept my hands in the soil because my hands in the soil is the most honest thing I know how to do, and the moment called for honesty. She looked at the cutting garden, the long rectangular bed in the center, still bare in the April light. She said, "I haven't been able to touch it." I said, "I know." She said it was his. I said, "Yes." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "What would you plant there?" Not asking me to do it, asking what I would plant. The question of someone who is starting to wonder if the future tense is something they have access to again. I thought about it. I told her I would start with one thing, not a plan, not a vision for the whole bed. One seed in the ground and the waiting that follows. She looked at the bed. She said, "Just one." I said, "The bed will tell you what comes next, but you have to put something in first." She looked at me for a moment. She said, "Can I have one?" I went to the shed. I came back with a seed packet. Echinacea, which is a hardy thing, a prairie flower, a plant that goes dormant in winter and comes back reliably in spring for years after the first planting. I gave her the packet. I pointed to the center of the cutting garden. I told her 3 inches deep, a foot from the center stake, firm the soil after. She looked at the packet in her hand. She looked at the bed, and then she walked to the center of the cutting garden, and she knelt in the April soil in her morning coat, and she planted a seed. I did not watch her do it. I went back to the rose bed and I kept my hands in the soil and I let her have the complete privacy of the act, because some things need to happen without a witness, not because they are shameful but because they are sacred, and the sacred requires a certain solitude to be fully received. I could hear the sounds of it, as I said, the tool and the soil and the pressing of her hands, and underneath, those sounds something that was not a sound at all but a quality of presence in the garden that was different from what had been there before. Something had been put in the ground. Something had been begun. I do not know how to explain this in terms that are not the terms of someone who has spent 30 years tending living things, but the garden knows when something has changed, and on that April morning in the rose bed along the east wall, the garden knew. I went back to the rose bed. I kept my hands in the soil and I let her have the moment because the moment was hers. Some things you have to do with nobody watching. The planting of a first thing after a long nothing is one of them. I could hear the small sounds of it, the tool in the soil, the press of her hands firming the earth, and then silence, which was the silence of someone staying with what they had just done. After a while she came to the edge of the rose bed. She said, "Thank you." I said, "Give it 3 weeks." She said, "And then what?" I said, "And then you come back and look." She nodded. She went inside. I want to tell you what I did after she went inside that morning because what I did matters and it is very simple, and that simplicity is the point. I went back to the rose bed. I kept working. I did not think about Eleanor or the seed or what might or might not happen in the cutting garden. I thought about the roses which needed my attention, and I gave them my attention, which is the whole of what the work requires. This is the thing I learned from my grandfather in Accra and from Grace and from the 2 years after Grace and from 9 years of tending 12 acres of grounds in Winnetka. You do the work that is in front of you. You give the earth your hands. You do not decide in advance what will happen next. You prepare the soil and you plant the seed and you come back tomorrow and do it again. The rest is not yours to manage. The rest is the business of the season, which has been conducting itself without your input for longer than you have been alive, and which will continue to do so long after you are gone, and which does not require your anxiety about the outcome in order to produce it. She came back in 3 weeks, and 4 days after that. And then every morning, the way you come back to something you have put yourself into, checking and waiting and learning, which is the same as caring, which is the same as being alive in the direction of the future. The echinacea did not come up for 6 weeks. I knew it would not, and I did not tell her this, not because I wanted to withhold the information, but because the waiting is part of it and the part cannot be skipped. She came every morning. She did not always say anything. Sometimes she just stood at the edge of the bed and looked. I kept working. I kept my hands in the soil. And one morning in late May she came out at her usual time and she stood at the edge of the cutting garden, and after a moment she called to me. I looked up. She was pointing at the center of the bed, one small green shoot, the first thing. I walked over. I stood beside her and we both looked at it. She said nothing for a long time. And then she made a sound that was not a word, a sound that was the thing beneath words, the sound of something releasing that has been held a very long time. She was crying, not the controlled tears of a woman managing her grief in front of another person. The crying of someone who has just understood that the ground is still producing, that the season is still turning, that the cutting garden that belonged to James was going to bloom again in a year she had not known, in the months she had not yet lived, in a future that had not yet announced itself but was already, quietly, underway. I did not put my hand on her shoulder. I did not offer reassurance. I stood beside her at the edge of the cutting garden, and I looked at the small green shoot, and I let the garden do what the garden does, which is to show you that the thing you planted is still in the ground and has been growing all along even when you could not see it. She stayed for a long time. When she finally turned to go inside, she looked at me and she said, "Samuel." I said, "Yes." She said, "I need to plant more." I said, "I know. We can do that this week." She nodded. She went inside. I went back to work. She offered me money that evening. Her assistant called the main house number and left a message for me. A significant sum, offered as a bonus for what she described as exceptional service above and beyond the grounds contract. I called back the next morning and I declined. The assistant sounded uncertain about how to receive this. I said, please tell Ms. Hartwell that the seed was not exceptional service. It was just what the season called for. The assistant relayed this and called back 20 minutes later and said Ms. Hartwell would like to know what she can do instead. I thought about it. I told the assistant to tell Ms. Hartwell that the cutting garden could use a second gardener in the growing season, someone to tend the beds that James had started, and that if she was looking for somewhere to put what she was feeling, the garden would take it. The assistant relayed this. There was a pause on the line, and then the assistant said, she says she'll be out at 7 tomorrow morning. She has been every morning since. She does not need my instruction anymore. She learned the cutting garden the way you learn anything that matters, by putting her hands in it day after day until the hands know what to do without being told. James planted that garden 5 years ago. Eleanor tends it now. It blooms every summer. I have never seen it look better than it did last July, which was the first summer she had been tending it for a full year, and which was also, though she did not say this directly to me, what would have been their 24th anniversary. I want to tell you about the summer the cutting garden bloomed for the first time under Eleanor's tending, because the summer is the resolution and resolutions deserve to be described. The echinacea that Eleanor planted in April came up strong and bloomed in July, purple and tall, exactly where she had put the seed, and she cut the first stem herself and brought it inside and put it in a vase on the kitchen table that I know from the kitchen staff had not had flowers in it since November. The other beds in the cutting garden she replanted over the course of May and June, slowly, one thing at a time, in the way you approach something that has been untouched for a long time, with patience and with the understanding that you are not restoring something lost, but building something new on the same ground. She planted dahlias in the section James had always left for dahlias. She planted zinnias along the south edge where he had started them and never finished. She left one bed empty through the whole season, which I did not ask about and which I understood was the bed she was not ready for yet, and which is also part of the work. Knowing which bed to leave empty is as important as knowing which one to plant. My daughter Abina called me the evening of the day Eleanor came out with her trowel for the first time. She always calls on Thursdays. I told her what had happened. She was quiet in the way she gets quiet when something is sitting with her. Then she said, Daddy, the garden taught you and you taught her. I thought about that. I said I did not teach her anything. She said you gave her the seed. I said the seed was just a seed. She said, Papa, you know that is not true. And I thought about my grandfather in Accra when I was 7 years old, putting a seed in my hand and telling me the earth will take your troubles if you give it your hands. And I thought about Grace, who died on a Saturday morning making coffee, and the 2 years after that I spent in the soil, and what the soil gave me back. And I thought about Eleanor at the window for 11 months, and the April morning she came outside, and the small green shoot in the cutting garden in May. And I said to Abina, no, it is not just a seed. You are right about that. She laughed. I heard her mother in the laugh. That happens sometimes, and I have learned to receive it as a gift rather than a wound. Some things you learn in a garden and some things you learn over 22 years of a life with someone, and some things you learn in the years after that life ends. In the mornings, you spend on your knees in the soil giving the earth your hands because it is the only thing you know how to do that helps. All of that learning is the same learning. It just arrives by different routes. Before you go, I want to ask you one thing, and I want you to sit with it before you answer. Is there something in your life that you have not yet planted because you are afraid that planting it means accepting that the person you planted it with is not here to see it grow? I am not asking you to be ready. Ready is not a requirement. The seed does not ask if you are ready. It asks only if you are willing to put it in the ground. The ground will do the rest. It always does. Tell me in the comments what you would plant if you were willing. Tell me who it is for. I read every single one and I would be honored to know. Hit subscribe if you have not yet. Leave a like so this reaches the person who needs it tonight. And I will see you in the next one.